The private dining room on the 52nd floor went silent when Diane Whitfield reached for her assistant a second time. Nobody stood. Nobody dared look straight at the woman who controlled billions of dollars and the future of nearly 10,000 employees. Nobody except me. I'm the single father in the old charcoal coat who pushed back the chair at the far end of the table. She looked at me the way you look at a caterer who'd wandered into the wrong room. I said 4 words, cold enough to freeze the air. Touch her again. Then finally, she recognized me. If you enjoy stories where arrogance pays the full price, stay with me and watch what Diane Whitfield realizes next. 3 hours earlier, I walked into the Whitfield Meridian Tower wearing a suit I'd owned for 11 years, carrying a leather briefcase with a cracked handle and a small stain near the clasp where my daughter had once spilled apple juice. No car service waited at the curb. No assistant walked half a step behind me. The receptionist studied my badge, then my shoes, then pointed me toward the service elevator, assuming I belonged to the contractor crew refitting the ventilation on floor 30. I didn't correct her. People build a story about you in 4 seconds, and arguing only makes them defend it. So I rode the freight elevator up with 2 men carrying copper wire, and one of them offered me half a granola bar, and I took it because I'd skipped breakfast getting my daughter to school. I was there because Graham Foster had called me at 9 the previous evening and asked in the careful voice of a man who suspects his own building whether I still remembered how to read a deal that had been dressed up for company. Whitfield Meridian was preparing to acquire a regional freight operation called Ridgeline Logistics for $2.4 billion, and the chief executive wanted the board to approve it that same night over dinner with the champagne already chilling. Graham had listed me on the attendance sheet under 4 words that meant almost nothing: independent operations consultant. He'd done that on purpose. He wanted me in the room before anyone decided what I was, because the moment a company knows an auditor has arrived, the company starts performing. The important thing, the thing that shaped every hour that followed, was that Diane Whitfield didn't know who I was. She'd built her career on the assumption that anyone worth fearing arrived announced. So when she passed me in the 28th floor corridor and her eyes dropped to the plain steel watch on my wrist, she turned to the executive walking beside her and asked, loud enough that 3 other people heard it, whether Foster was bringing freelancers into board meetings. She said the word freelancer the way some people say the word infection. I heard every syllable and felt the small, familiar heat behind my ribs that I've spent years learning to leave unattended.
"It seems so," I said. "That was all. I've found that calm bothers a certain kind of powerful person far more than argument does, because argument gives them something to win." Diane's jaw tightened. She was 42. 3rd generation of a financial family that had been lending money since the 1890s, and she'd spent her entire adult life inside rooms that arranged themselves around her mood. My flat, unbothered answer didn't arrange itself around anything. She walked on, heels striking the marble like a metronome set slightly too fast, and I understood something about her before we'd exchanged 12 words. She didn't want obedience. She wanted the visible act of obedience. There's a difference, and the difference is where cruelty lives. While the executives filed into the preliminary session, I watched her assistant. Rachel Turner was 31, sharp-eyed, competent in the way only exhausted people are, carrying 3 binders and a tablet while trying to keep her hands from shaking. She had that specific hollow look I recognized from the last year of my own marriage, the look of a person doing everything right inside a situation that's already been rigged against them. When Diane handed Rachel a binder, Diane opened it, glanced at the header, and closed it again with a small, dry sound. "This is the 2nd version," Diane said. "Perhaps this job has finally exceeded your capabilities." She said it in front of 9 people. Two of them looked at the ceiling. One studied his phone with tremendous interest. Nobody spoke for Rachel. And that silence told me more about Whitfield Meridian than any balance sheet could have. I began to understand that whatever was wrong with this company wasn't living in the numbers. The numbers were only where it had left its footprints. Rachel gathered the binder back, apologized twice for something that wasn't her fault, and turned toward the door. As she passed me, a folder slipped from the stack under her arm and fanned open against the carpet. I crouched to gather the pages. I didn't intend to read them, but one line sat at the top of the third sheet in bold black type, and it went into me like a splinter. Projected loss exposure, $186,400,000. I handed the folder back and said nothing. Rachel's eyes met mine for less than a second, and in that second I saw that she knew exactly what I'd just read, that she was terrified, and that some small, starved part of her was relieved another human being had finally seen it. Then she was gone down the corridor. I stood in the hallway of a company worth $30 billion, holding my cracked briefcase, and ran that figure against every page of the board packet Graham had sent me the night before. $186,400,000. It appeared nowhere, not in the summary, not in the appendices, not in the risk narrative, not in a single footnote of a document the directors were expected to vote on before dessert. The preliminary session began at 2, and Diane presented Ridgeline Logistics the way a museum presents its best painting. She stood at the head of a table of black walnut in front of a window with the whole gray river laid out behind her, and she called the acquisition the most consequential expansion Whitfield Meridian would make in a decade. She spoke
Without notes. She was, I'll admit freely, extraordinarily good at it. She had the trick of making a forecast sound like a memory, as though the profits had already happened and the vote were merely a formality of paperwork. The directors nodded along in the small rhythmic way people nod when they've decided to agree before they arrived. I did not nod. When she asked, with a thin performance of graciousness, whether the room had questions, I asked 3. Why had Ridgeline's insurance costs risen 41% in 18 months when its fleet hadn't grown? Why did 3 of its 5 largest customer contracts contain cancellation clauses that triggered on a change of ownership? And why was an exposure of $186,400,000 absent from every page the board had been given? The room changed temperature. I've sat in perhaps 200 rooms like that one over the course of my working life, and there's a particular sound that happens when a question lands somewhere someone had sealed shut, a sound made of chairs shifting and pens being set down very carefully. Elliot Banks, the chief financial officer, went absolutely still. Marianne Walsh, the independent director, turned toward me slowly, like someone hearing a noise in a house she thought was empty. Diane didn't answer me at all. She looked at Rachel, standing against the wall by the credenza, and her voice came out flat as a blade laid on a table. Where did he get that number? Rachel said she'd provided nothing. She said it steadily, which took more courage than anyone in that room was equipped to notice. Diane held her gaze 3 seconds longer than necessary, filing it away, then turned to me with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. She told the room that men in my position frequently look at 2 or 3 spreadsheets and mistake that for understanding how an enterprise breathes. She said consultants collect anomalies the way children collect stones, and that the difference between an anomaly and a risk is judgment, and that judgment was what her family had been accumulating for a century and a quarter, while people like me billed by the hour. I didn't argue with her. Arguing would have handed her the room. An empire can still go bankrupt because of one small line in a spreadsheet. 2 directors looked at each other. That was all I wanted. Diane heard it and understood she'd just lost ground in front of people whose opinions determined her authority, and did what her instincts had always rewarded.
She informed me, in the tone one uses with a junior clerk, that I shouldn't speak again unless directly addressed. After the session, she instructed Rachel, loudly enough for me to hear, from 20 feet away, to move me from the guest dining allocation to the support staff cafeteria on floor 11, because the guest count had been miscalculated. It hadn't been miscalculated. Rachel came to tell me with visible misery, apologizing for a decision she'd had no part in. "It's all right," I told her. "I can eat anywhere." I meant it, and I think that was the first moment she began to consider that I might not be exactly what my coat suggested. Status has never had much grip on me. It had grip on me once in my early 30s when I owned a firm and a good watch and a view of a harbor. Then my wife got sick, and I discovered in about 11 weeks how many of those things could keep a person company.
At 2 a.m. in a hospital corridor. After that, the seating chart at a corporate dinner stopped being able to reach me. What can still reach me is watching a person get crushed in public while everyone with the power to stop it decides to study the tablecloth. Rachel found me by the window at the end of the 11th floor corridor 40 minutes later. She stood beside me and looked out at the river a while before saying anything. Then she told me quietly that the report I'd glimpsed was an internal version, version 5. There was a version 6 prepared for the board, and the difference between them was $186,400,000 and about 9 pages of supplier obligations. She said the instruction not to circulate version 4 had come from the executive office directly, that she'd been the one told to make the substitution, that she'd done it, and that she hadn't slept properly in 9 days. I told her not to tell me anything else in a hallway. I told her that whatever she was holding, she shouldn't carry it alone for even one more day, that there were structures designed for exactly her situation, and that I could explain them when we were somewhere with a door. She nodded once, quickly, the way people nod when they're afraid that agreeing out loud will make it real. Then I glanced past her shoulder toward the far end of the corridor. Diane Whitfield was standing there, perfectly still, watching both of us. She had Rachel in her office within 11 minutes. I know because I was in the small conference room next door, reviewing supplier schedules, and the wall between those rooms is glass with an acoustic seal that engineering never quite finished. I heard most of it, and what I heard has stayed with me, because there wasn't one raised voice in the entire exchange. Diane didn't need to raise her voice. She had something far more efficient than volume, and she used it with the unhurried precision of a surgeon who'd performed the same procedure 400 times. She reminded Rachel that her employment agreement contained a confidentiality provision covering proprietary financial materials. She reminded her that finance is a very small industry, smaller than people imagine, and that a single measured remark from a Whitfield at a single dinner could ensure Rachel never again held a comparable position anywhere between here and the coast. She reminded her that the apartment on Fenwick Street, the one Rachel had lived in for 4 years, within walking distance of her mother's care facility, was corporate housing, and that corporate housing follows employment. She let each of those facts sit in the air by itself, unhurried, giving them room to grow. And then she said the sentence I've never been able to forget: "Do not confuse my kindness with permission to betray me." Rachel signed nothing that afternoon, but she was made to say out loud that the discrepancy between the 2 report versions had been an administrative error on her part. She said it in a voice I could barely hear. I was standing in the corridor when the door opened and Diane came out and saw me there, and she understood at once approximately how much I'd heard and wasn't remotely concerned about it. "Don't try to play the hero here, Mr. Cole," she said.
"I haven't done anything," I said. She laughed, one short exhalation, almost affectionate in its contempt. "Precisely, and that is how you keep your contract." That was a deeper cut than the freelancer remark, and she knew it. She'd decided I was a man who needed money, and in her arithmetic, a man who needs money is a man whose spine has a price attached to it. She'd apparently asked human resources for whatever basic file existed on me because she added, adjusting the cuff of her jacket, that she understood I was raising a child by myself. She said it with the mildest possible inflection, which is how the most dangerous things are usually said. She told me I had a family to feed and that she'd advise me to remember that before I decided to make any of this my problem. Something in me went cold then. Not angry. I passed through angry years ago and came out the other side into something quieter and considerably more durable. My daughter is 8 years old. She has her mother's laugh and a deep, unreasonable loyalty to a stuffed elephant with one ear. When Diane Whitfield reached for her as a lever, she stopped being a difficult executive and became something I understood completely. My family, I said, is exactly how I know when someone is using power the wrong way. She left. I stood in the corridor and let my pulse come down. Rachel came out a few minutes later with her makeup carefully repaired and her hands not quite steady and told me the rest of it, or the part she knew. Ridgeline Logistics was carrying a series of undisclosed financial obligations across its supplier network. Deferred maintenance liabilities, a pension shortfall in its northern division, and 2 settlement agreements sealed under confidentiality. Aggregated exposure could exceed $400 million within 30 months of closing. Why, though? That was the piece Rachel couldn't supply. A chief executive who buys a broken company destroys her own record, and Diane Whitfield was many things, but she wasn't careless about her record, which meant the transaction wasn't the point. The transaction was the vehicle. I walked to the stairwell where the reception is poor and nobody lingers and made one phone call. "Graham," I said, "don't hold the vote tonight." There were several seconds of silence on the other end, long enough that I could hear the faint sound of his office clock. Then the chairman of Whitfield Meridian said, very quietly, "You found it then."
Beautiful evening. I've seen that technique used at least a dozen times. It works far more often than it should. She noticed me as the room was settling and made a small performance out of it, pausing with her wine glass halfway up, letting the conversation die down. "You're still here?" she asked. "Chairman Foster requested it. Graham is occasionally too polite with people who don't know their place." Several people heard that. 2 of them winced. Not one of them said a word. I want to be honest about what that silence is, because it's the actual subject of this whole story. Those weren't weak people. They ran divisions and funds and factories, but every one of them had done the same rapid private calculation. The cost of speaking is mine, and the cost of silence is hers. That arithmetic is how a room of accomplished adults becomes furniture. Rachel worked through the dinner. She shouldn't have been working at all, but she moved along the table distributing the final agreement package, 1 folder at each place setting, her face composed, her eyes going nowhere near her employer. Then Diane asked her for the execution copy, and with it her initials on the transmittal certification, the single page confirming that all appendices had been fully reviewed by the board. Rachel set the folder down. She didn't pick up the pen. She said clearly that she couldn't certify that because the appendices had not been provided to the board. I watched Diane's face do something I'd only seen once before, 7 years ago, in a conference room 11 floors below us. It didn't become furious, it became empty. Fury is a human weather. What crossed her features was closer to the expression of a machine encountering an obstruction it hadn't been designed to expect. "Initial it," she said. Rachel said no a second time. Her voice cracked in the middle of the word, and she said it anyway. I want that recorded because everything that happened afterward was built on a 31-year-old woman with a mother in a care facility and an apartment she'd lose, saying 1 syllable into a room of 22 silent people. Diane stood. She crossed the 2 steps between them and took the folder out of Rachel's hands hard enough that the pages came loose and went across the floor in a white spill.
Then she caught Rachel's wrist and pulled her back toward the table, leaned in and said softly, but not so softly that the four nearest guests could pretend otherwise, "You work for me." Rachel asked her to let go. Diane did not let go. I stood up. My chair made almost no sound on the carpet. I didn't shout. There were $400,000 of orchids and crystal between us, and I spoke across all of it at a completely ordinary volume, because I knew for 6 hours exactly what I was holding. And a man who knows what he's holding has no reason to be loud.
Touch her again. Diane turned. Her fingers opened and Rachel's wrist came free, and Rachel stepped back against the credenza with both hands pressed flat behind her. Then all of that contained pressure, having lost its original target, came around and found me. "Did you just threaten me?" she said. "No, I'm giving you a chance to stop." She laughed and walked toward me, closer than the situation required, which is a habit of people who have never once been physically afraid of anyone. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Yes. Then you should know I can make certain you're never hired in this industry again." I looked at her for a few seconds, then down the table. Graham Foster set his fork on the edge of his plate and folded his hands. Marianne Walsh turned fully in her chair. Elliot Banks began very slowly to lose color. "You already tried that once," I said. Her smile stopped. I watched her actually look at my face for the first time in 7 years, not at the coat or the watch or the badge, at the face. And I saw her run it against some old file she'd closed and archived and been assured was permanently shut. Her eyes moved down and found the small steel ring on my right hand, the one my wife had bought at a market in Vermont for $9 because I wouldn't wear anything expensive. "Cole," she whispered. "You remembered?" I said. "Finally." 7 years ago, I was the managing principal of Cole Strategic Recovery, a restructuring firm with 19 employees, no marketing department, and a reputation that got us into rooms companies 4 times our size couldn't enter. We were hired when a business was 2 quarters from a fatal mistake, and the people running it were too invested to see it. In the spring of that year, Whitfield Meridian ran into a liquidity crisis in its industrial services division, and Graham Foster, then a newer chairman, brought us in to determine whether the division could be saved or should be amputated. It could be saved. The problem was that when we traced 4 years of capital allocation, every significant decision led to the same office. Diane Whitfield was vice chair then, 35, groomed with total certainty to the top of the building. She'd pushed 3 acquisitions and 1 financing structure that together produced a debt profile that wouldn't survive a single bad winter. It wasn't fraud, it was arrogance holding a signing authority, which is often more expensive. She came to my office alone on a Thursday evening and asked me to restructure the report. Not falsify, she was careful about that. Restructure. Present the findings by division rather than by decision maker, which would have distributed the responsibility across 11 executives like water poured on sand. She explained that she was 3 years from the chief executive position and that this report, in its current shape, would cost her those 3 years. And she pointed out with perfect accuracy that Cole Strategic did roughly 19% of its annual revenue with entities connected to her family. I filed the report as written. Within 5 weeks, our contract was terminated. Our final invoice was disputed for 8 months, and 4 prospective clients quietly stopped returning calls. I never proved she made those calls. I didn't need to. But the report itself reached Graham Foster's hands, and Graham did what chairmen are supposed to do exactly once or twice in a career: act on information that's inconvenient for everyone, including himself. The Industrial Services Division was restructured over 14 months. Whitfield Meridian avoided losses our modeling put just under $1 billion.
My name appeared nowhere in the record of it because the settlement of our disputed invoice came with a confidentiality provision I signed without reading twice because by then my wife had been diagnosed and I had approximately no attention left for anything else. She died the following November. I sold my equity to a partner who deserved it, stopped flying, and started making school lunches. Diane Whitfield believed I had evaporated the way inconvenient people are supposed to. What she didn't know was that for 6 years, Graham Foster had quietly continued to retain me for the one category of assignment where a client cannot trust its own reporting lines. In the dining room, Diane recovered her footing faster than most people would. That's a real ability, and I won't pretend otherwise. She straightened her jacket and said, with the composure back in place, that an accomplishment from 7 years ago didn't make me a person with authority in this room. "No," I said, "but the mandate the board gave me last week does." She stopped moving entirely. I told the room what I was. I hadn't been engaged by the operations group as a consultant, and Graham had listed me under that title deliberately, so the company would behave normally around me for one full day. I'd been retained by the Independent Audit Committee of Whitfield Meridian under a resolution passed 9 days earlier to conduct a complete pre-closing assessment of the Ridgeline Logistics transaction with unrestricted access to financial systems, supplier records, and the executive document repository. Elliott Banks spoke before Diane did, which was the most useful mistake he made all evening. He said that couldn't be correct because such a mandate would grant access to reconciliation files sealed at the executive level, and he said the words reconciliation files in a way that told everyone at the table he knew precisely which ones mattered. Diane turned to the head of the table. "Graham?" Graham Foster said nothing at all. He simply looked back at her with the patience of a 68-year-old man who'd already made his decision in a smaller room earlier that day. That silence confirmed everything, and every investor at that table understood it. And I
watched the value of Diane Whitfield's authority in that room drop to nearly nothing in the space of 4 seconds. And $186 million, I said, is not the biggest problem. I didn't raise my voice for the rest of the evening. I want to be clear about the mechanics of what happened next, because it wasn't clever and it wasn't dramatic. It was 11 days of reading. First, Rachel Turner hadn't leaked anything to me. I said that early, because Diane's next move would require a traitor, and I intended to remove the option before she reached for it. I'd found the discrepancy through 3 channels unconnected to the executive office. Ridgeline's commercial insurance premiums had risen 41%, which never happens without claims history or an underwriter repricing a risk profile. And that supplemental schedule was a public filing in 2 states. Its supplier remittances showed 41 payments over 19 months routed through one intermediary rather than directly. That intermediary sat inside a related entity called Northgate Holdings. Northgate Holdings held $412 million of Ridgeline's subordinated debt, acquired across the previous 2 years at what I estimated to be between 51 and 58 cents on the dollar. Ridgeline was, in plain language, a distressed asset. But under the acquisition structure Diane had put in front of the board, Whitfield Meridian would assume that subordinated debt at face value as a condition of closing. I asked the room a simple question: who owns Northgate Holdings? Diane said it was an unaffiliated private credit fund, that its participation had been disclosed in the transaction summary as a third-party creditor, which was technically true, and which is the most dangerous kind of true. I put a single document on the table in front of Graham Foster. It was a beneficial ownership chain,
4 layers deep, running from Northgate Holdings through 2 intermediate limited partnerships in Delaware and 1 in Wyoming, terminating in a single instrument, the Whitfield Heritage Trust. Diane Whitfield was one of its 4 principal beneficiaries. Her entitlement was 31%. The room didn't gasp. Real rooms never do. It went completely, absolutely quiet, and an investor near the window put down his glass with a small click I could hear from 12 feet away, because everybody at that table understood the arithmetic instantly. This wasn't a chief executive making an aggressive bet on a struggling company. This was a chief executive causing a company she controlled to pay face value for debt that a trust she benefited from had purchased at half price. The $240 million of value the board had been told they were capturing was in fact the amount being transferred out of the shareholders and into the trust. She fought. I expected her to, and she did it well. She told the room I'd arrived with a 7-year grievance and spent 9 days building a story around it. That beneficial ownership chains through family trusts are ordinary. That the Heritage Trust held positions in over 200 entities. She called me a failed man attempting to relive a period when he mattered. Said I'd sold my firm and vanished from the industry and come back in that old suit, and I shouldn't pretend any of this was ethics. She said it was bitterness.
I didn't answer any of that. Emotional arguments are quicksand. I asked one question instead. If I'm wrong, will you consent to opening the full Northgate file to the audit committee right now, tonight, every layer? She didn't answer. The silence lasted perhaps 6 seconds, and it did more damage than 400 pages of analysis. Marianne Walsh put her napkin on the table and moved formally that the vote be postponed pending independent verification. Elliott Banks objected immediately and forcefully, saying the transaction had a financing commitment that expired at the end of the month and that delay would cost the company real money. I turned to him. You should agree with her. Why? He said. Because the second account is in your name. Elliott Banks sat down without appearing to decide to. $816,000 had moved in 11 payments from a Northgate advisory subsidiary to a consulting entity registered under his wife's maiden name. I had the wire references, and he knew it, because he watched me recite them without looking at a page. He tried to leave. He got as far as pushing his chair back and reaching for his jacket, and Graham Foster said, "Sit down, Elliott," in a voice like a door closing. Nobody blocked the exit. Nobody touched him. The doors stayed open all evening. But Elliott Banks was a financial officer with 23 years of career behind him, and he understood that walking out of that room at that moment would be the single most expensive step he ever took. So he sat, put his hands flat on the tablecloth, and didn't speak again for a very long time. Then Diane did the thing I'd been waiting for since the corridor that afternoon. She turned on Rachel. She told the room her executive assistant had been copying confidential transaction materials for weeks, that the document irregularities were Rachel's doing, that Rachel had access to the repository and a grievance about a performance review in January, and that this entire evening was the product of a disloyal employee feeding fragments to an outside party with a personal vendetta. She constructed it in about 40 seconds, and it was coherent, and if I hadn't been prepared for it, it very likely had worked. That's what makes people like her dangerous. They don't lie clumsily, they build. Rachel went white and couldn't get a full sentence out, which is what happens to honest people accused in front of 22 strangers. I didn't let it stand. The document management system at Whitfield Meridian maintains a complete revision history with authenticated user attribution retained for 7 years, and the audit committee's mandate had given me direct access to it on the second day. I'd already pulled it. the substitution of version 4 with version 5, the removal of 9 appendix pages, the alteration of the risk narrative in the board summary, and the deletion of 2 exposure tables had all been executed from a single administrative credential belonging to the executive office. Timestamps between 11:41 p.m. and 12:19 a.m. on a Sunday. Rachel Turner's credential didn't possess write access to that repository. She couldn't have made those changes if she'd wanted to. What she'd done was transmit the substituted version when instructed, then refuse twice in a room full of people who wouldn't help her to certify a lie.
No. Then what do you imagine you've won? I put the cracked briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was the Audit Committee's preliminary findings report, 41 pages. And beneath it, the minutes of a special session of the board's governance committee held at 7 that morning, 14 floors below the room we were standing in. Section 11.4 of the Whitfield Meridian Corporate Governance Charter permits the board, upon presentation of credible evidence of an undisclosed conflict of interest by an executive officer in connection with a transaction exceeding $1 billion in value, to suspend that officer's operating authority with immediate effect by simple majority without notice. Period. Her great-grandfather had written that provision. He'd written it because he'd watched a competitor destroyed from the inside in 1922, and he'd wanted his descendants protected from their own executives. Marianne Walsh read the resolution aloud. Her voice was steady and unhurried, and she didn't look up from the page once. Diane Whitfield was suspended from the office of Chief Executive, effective immediately, pending completion of the independent investigation. Nobody handcuffed her. No police arrived. There were no raised voices and no security escort waiting theatrically by the elevator. What happened was that a woman in a black jacket stood in a beautiful room on the 52nd floor while 22 people who'd been afraid of her for years sat perfectly still and looked at her and did not stand up and did not intervene and did not offer her anything at all. I think that was worse than any arrest would have been. Her executive access credential was deactivated at 9:26 while she was still standing there. I know the time because Graham's phone showed the confirmation, and he turned it face down out of what I believe was genuine mercy. Elliot Banks was suspended in the same resolution, by the same majority, in under 90 seconds. The dinner she'd designed as a celebration of the largest transaction of her career became, without anyone moving to a different room or changing the tablecloth, the meeting that ended her control of her family's company. The orchids were still fresh. The dessert was never served. She turned to me last, and she got there in the end, which I'll give her credit for. "So this is the part where you sit in my chair," she said. I closed the briefcase. No. Graham Foster confirmed it for the room because he knew I wouldn't elaborate. The board had formally offered me the interim chief executive position 11 days earlier at the same session that created my mandate, with a compensation package I won't repeat because the number is obscene and irrelevant. I had declined it before I ever entered the building. That was the piece Diane couldn't process, and I watched her try. In her model of the world, everything I'd done over 9 days was a campaign for a seat, because a seat was the only thing worth 9 days. She could imagine me as vengeful. She could imagine me as
ambitious. She had no available category for a man who'd gone to that much trouble and didn't want the office at the end of it. I agreed to stay 90 days as restructuring advisor. That was all. Not because I'm noble, but because there were 9,600 employees, 240 suppliers, and a pension fund in the Northern Division that had nothing to do with whose trust owned what, and somebody had to make certain they didn't pay for a decision made in a room they were never invited into. 90 days, a consulting rate that was frankly modest, and no title on any door, which made the whole afternoon considerably bitter for her in retrospect, and I imagine she's thought about it since.
She'd told me to remember I had a family to feed. She told me that keeping my mouth shut was how I kept my contract. She believed with total confidence that I needed the work. Whitfield Meridian needed me. I needed nothing from that building except to get home by 7 for dinner, which I'd already missed. Before she left, Diane looked at Rachel. There was a moment where the old machinery tried to engage, where 20 years of habit reached for a threat, and there was nothing left to reach with. No termination, no reference, no apartment, no industry. I was standing about 4 steps from Rachel, and I didn't say anything, and I didn't move, and Diane understood the boundary perfectly, because boundaries only require explanation the first time. She walked out. Her heels made the same metronome sound on the marble they'd made that afternoon, slightly too fast, and then the elevator doors closed, and the sound stopped. Whitfield Meridian terminated the Ridgeline Logistics acquisition 11 days later before signing, at a break cost of $9 million against exposure the final independent modeling put at $431 million. That was the least expensive $9 million the company ever spent. The Northgate subordinated debt position was never assumed. The Heritage Trust made nothing. The investigation ran 14 weeks and concluded that Diane Whitfield had failed to disclose a material personal financial interest in a transaction she originated and pushed toward an expedited vote, and had directed the alteration of board materials. She resigned as chief executive before the report was published, which was the last piece of strategy available to her, and I thought a reasonably intelligent one. Elliott Banks left the company the same month. Neither of them went to prison. I have never believed the ending of a story like this requires a sell. What they lost was the thing they'd actually been using, the authority, the room that arranged itself around their moods, the standing that had let them look at people like Rachel Turner and decide what those people were worth. That is a real loss, and it doesn't get returned. Rachel was offered the position of Director of Executive Operations in the second month. Graham wanted to announce it immediately, framed around the investigation, and I asked him not to. I told him not to make her the girl who got rescued, because that framing would follow her into every room for a decade and let people credit her career to my dinner. She got the role on the strength of 11 years of work, and because on a night when 6 directors and 11 investors and 4 executives all decided that silence was survivable, a 31-year-old assistant with everything to lose put down a pen twice. I finished on day 90. The Northern pension shortfall was funded. The supplier remittance structure was rebuilt with direct payment, and the audit committee got a permanent chair. Independent reporting line that doesn't pass through the executive floor. Graham offered me a long-term position again on my last afternoon, and the figure was even more absurd than the first one, and I turned it down in the elevator so neither of us had to sit with it. At 6:12, my phone lit up with a message asking whether I'd be home in time for dinner and whether we could have the pasta with too much cheese. I smiled at the screen in the lobby of a $30 billion company like an idiot. "Dad's on his way," I wrote. I walked out through the revolving doors with the cracked briefcase and nobody car waiting and nobody applauding. Rachel came through the doors behind me and caught up on the sidewalk. She had a lanyard now with a title on it. She asked me the question she apparently been holding for 3 months. "Why did you stand up that night? You didn't even know me." I stopped on the sidewalk and thought about how to answer honestly, which took a second. "You don't have to know a person," I said, "to know they don't deserve to be treated that way." She stood outside the building and watched me go until I merged into the crowd on Halsted Street and stopped being distinguishable from anyone else, which is a thing she told me about later. Here's what I've kept from it. 3 months earlier, every single person in that dining room knew Diane Whitfield was in the wrong, not suspected, knew. 6 directors, 11 investors, 4 executives, 22 adults with unobstructed sight lines and functioning consciences, and exactly one of them stood up. Not because I was stronger than she was, because I wasn't, and she could have ended a dozen careers in that room with 4 phone calls. Not because I was wealthier, because I made less in a year than she spent on cars. Not even, in the end, because I was holding evidence that would finish her, though I was, and though it made standing up almost free. I stood up because power only becomes truly dangerous at the moment when the people watching it get abused decide silence is the safest option. Every threat she made that day rested on that assumption, and it had held for 20 years, right up until one person tested it. She had spent her life believing that money made a room belong to her. What actually happened is that the room belonged to her only for as long as nobody in it was willing to stand. When I looked back from the corner of Halsted Street, the letters on the glass behind Rachel read Whitfield Meridian in the late afternoon light, reversed and gold and perfectly legible. The name is still on the building. It's a good name, and it belongs to 4 generations of people, most of whom earned it. But the woman who believed that name entitled her to reach across a table and take hold of someone's wrist doesn't sit on the top floor anymore. That is the whole of it. Not a punishment, just a correction. Arriving late, delivered quietly, by a man in an 11-year-old suit who only ever wanted to get home for dinner.